Hi, my name is Cristina Wilson, and welcome to my podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Dr. Justine Bruyer's Literacy Development course. I am so excited because I have a special guest today who is a Peabody alum and an incredible LTDS, Dr. Emily Bigelow.
Hello, everyone.
Today we're going to be focusing our episode on an article by Judith Skickendans and Molly Collins, and it's from their book So Much More Than the ABCs, The Early Phases of Reading and Writing, and we'll specifically be focusing on Chapter 3, which presents this idea of the importance of reading storybooks with preschoolers. So before we delve into the chapter, I think we should just talk about read-alouds in general, because I think a lot of classrooms are lacking these reading experiences, and in the same way, a lot of classrooms are providing those experiences, but teachers are doing so simply because it's part of their routine and not necessarily because they know the importance of them. So I have a question for you, Dr. Bigelow. As an LTDS, you've had the opportunity to spend time in many classrooms. And even as a former teacher yourself, you've had the opportunity to incorporate read-alouds in your practice. So what has been your experience with read-alouds? And based on your observations and practice, how do you think they impact a student's literacy development?
We're ready for all walkers to be dismissed.
Please hold.
Okay, so I think that read-alouds are extremely important in the classroom, and the presence of read-alouds have an impact on students' literacy development in many ways. So first, we've got students who are seeing the way books should be handled and treated and used. So they're seeing people open the books and which way to turn the pages. So they're learning the concepts of print. They're learning that stories have meaning, that the words on the page tell a message. So they're really learning a lot about this idea of what reading looks like. And then moving beyond that, when we're talking about storybooks used in a classroom, it really helps to build a common set of knowledge. So if you read a story, and in the story a little boy is looking for his lost cat, then you can then refer to that and have a classroom discussion and build many different types of experiences off of this. So you can sort of level the playing field in terms of giving everyone something to talk about. And that talking piece is really important with young children and their language development. So as we are reading stories and children can chime in, they can help with rhyming parts, or they may start to even retell stories, then that is going to have a positive impact on their language development, which will then also help their literacy, their reading as well.
I love that, and that actually, I just made a connection to a quote on page 44, which says, "Part of the pleasure experienced from reading or listening to stories comes from the beautifully crafted language that differs from the ordinary, but children must hear book language in order to understand and learn to enjoy it." And
yeah, I think that hearing the book aloud is a really important piece. I think that many classrooms today have classroom libraries, and children are given time to look at books or told, this is reading time. But and that's really excellent. That's a great practice. But if they are not read the words by an adult, then they will miss that beautifully crafted language. They will miss the meaning and some of the higher level things that they can't access yet because they don't know how to decode.
I absolutely agree with you. And when I taught first grade as a former first grade teacher, I tried to provide those just reading experiences to my students, and I had the opportunity to experience what books can do and how reading a book aloud expands the world of a student and nourishes their imagination. And even my most reluctant readers began to crave the kinds of stories that they were hearing from me, and they started to pick up books on their own. So I think it's just such a powerful thing, and especially if it's being incorporated in preschool classrooms, imagine what that does for their attitudes towards reading in the many years to come. So let's talk a little bit more about the goals of storybook reading. We've touched upon some of them, but specifically just focusing in on how read alouds can build a classroom community. So I have another question for you. In what ways do you think hearing stories read aloud in a group helps build a classroom community? Do you think this is possible?
Yeah, so definitely possible. As I mentioned before, I think this idea of having a shared experience is really important. So in reading a story and talking about what's happening, you then have this other character, if you will, that you can bring into the classroom, refer to, talk about. If it's you might start to say, well, what would this character do? Or how would this person handle this? It's also useful for like dramatic play, and so children, when they are on the playground.
Would Miss Lemon and Miss Burgett please report to the gym for late bus duty? Miss Lemon and Miss Burgett to the gym for late bus duty.
It gives children stories that they can then interact and play out together in a dramatic play on the playground, even in writing and drawing, which I think is an important piece as well.
I definitely agree with you. And again, just making connections to my time teaching, I think that the read alouds really did give my students the opportunity to bond on certain issues and topics that they wouldn't otherwise be exposed to had I not read certain stories to them. And since read alouds are shared experiences, I feel that in and of itself helps them feel as if they're making sense of the stories and the world together. So
I think that building content piece is really important. We can build students' knowledge about many topics by reading books with their seeing pictures, things like that. And I also was thinking about when you were talking about the shared experiences of when other adults like parents or other teachers in the school come in and share a book, and how powerful that can be, and then that book is associated with that adult, and again, that's yet another shared experience for that classroom.
Yes, and even in one of my classes, we talked about bringing in community members and how powerful that experience could be.
Yes, we have some police officers here at Westmead that come just to visit and really just to build relationships with the students, because some of the students have seen negative interactions with police officers, with their family members, and they often pop in and just offer to read a story. And it's great for our students to see them in this role of reader and enjoying a storybook,
London to the front
as
for
opposed
dismissal.
to being
London for
a
dismissal.
stern police officer enforcing a law.
I love that. And so let's also give our listeners a little bit more info on what the criteria is for selecting storybooks. So this chapter really does talk about that a bit. So we actually shared an experience just last week where we were picking
Miss Shelley, please come to the office. Miss Shelley.
Where we picked some books that we wanted to provide to some third grade teachers so that they could read them aloud to students. So what criteria do you keep in mind as you are picking books for read alouds?
So there's a bunch of things to take into consideration, and you can think about them both quantitatively and qualitatively. So when we're thinking about quantitative things, we can think about the reading level or the lexile. We can think about how long the book is, how many words there are, or we could look at the complexity of the sentences. So there's certain things like that. In situations where we are reading the book aloud to students, we want to pick books that are more difficult than the children can typically read. So for the third grade, we were looking for books that were higher than a third grade level. The teacher can do that heavy lifting of the decoding, which means that students can access texts that are more difficult, that they wouldn't normally be able to do. There's also a lot of qualitative pieces that need to be taken into consideration. Things like the way that the images in a picture book match or don't match the words on the page. So sometimes the images really support what's going on, and sometimes they're a whole nother story. And so that is a piece of it. You also want to think about the language that's being used and whether that's going to be familiar to the students. And you've got the language piece, you've got the matching piece, the vocabulary, and then we also want to think about what the children's background knowledge is and what they already know about a topic. So if this is, a book, a fiction book that's taking place on during a baseball game, if children don't understand the game of baseball, that might hinder their understanding. So knowing your students and what their knowledge base is on certain topics is also really important.
Mm-hmm. And what you just said helped me make a connection to something that was in the article where they talked about big books and how big books, especially in preschool classrooms, are very frequently used for read-alouds, but then also presented this idea that sometimes it's best not to use a big book when reading aloud, because for that reason that you mentioned earlier about the pictures, and maybe it is better if the pictures are smaller so that the students can think more deeply about what's being said as opposed to just trying to understand the story through the pictures.
Yeah, and I think that another strategy with that is that sometimes I just don't even show the picture. I read the text first, or I will not turn the page yet, but get them to predict, or vice versa. Sometimes I show them the picture and say, now tell me what you think is going to happen. But all of these things are going to then impact when the child does start to read independently, and all of the strategies. We know that good readers pull from a variety of cueing systems when they're reading. So when we're reading and having these interactions with the students, we're helping get them ready to start to read for meaning, to read using different cueing systems.
Absolutely. And I think we can agree that just reading aloud, and when picking books, they should be books that may require multiple readings, and just giving the students the opportunity to really have chances to wonder and think about what's being presented in the text. And it's a very powerful thing. And thank you so much for listening. That's all the time we have for today, but thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in, and we hope that we got your juices flowing on the importance of read louds.
Happy reading!